Henry worked at a gas station and was having an especially difficult day. The sun was blazing relentlessly, and a steady stream of customers kept coming in to refuel their cars. Despite the unbearable heat, he served everyone efficiently and with a smile. In the midst of the rush, Henry noticed an elderly man in worn-out clothes walking towards him, with a worried expression on his face. The heat was overwhelming, and Henry had to exert extra effort to keep up the pace. He moved quickly between cars, smiling and offering fast service to each customer that pulled up. The lines didn't seem to shorten, and the fatigue was starting to catch up with him, but Henry kept pushing through. After serving another impatient driver, he spotted the elderly man approaching. The man's simple, worn-out clothing stood in stark contrast to the modern, polished vehicles around him. His face was etched with worry, as though he carried an invisible burden with each step. Henry glanced around to see if any of his colleagues could cover for him for a moment, but no one was free. He decided he could take a brief pause to see what the elderly man needed. He approached him, trying to maintain the same warm smile he offered to all his customers. "Good afternoon, how can I help you?" Henry asked, trying to mask the exhaustion in his voice. The old man looked at him with eyes full of uncertainty. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. After a deep breath, he finally tried to speak again but faltered. He must be ill, Henry thought. He patiently waited for the man to gather the strength to say what was on his mind. The sounds of cars and people continued around them, but in that moment, it felt as though there was a quiet space between the two of them. Henry closely observed the man, noticing how troubled he seemed. He could sense that something was deeply bothering him, and it prompted him to step closer. "My name is William," the elderly man eventually said in a quiet, hesitant voice. "I filled up my car, but I forgot my wallet at home." Henry immediately heard the sincerity in William's voice, and the worry etched on his face tugged at Henry's heart. He knew that such situations could happen to anyone, and he felt an instant urge to help. "I understand, William," Henry replied in a calm, reassuring tone. "Don't worry, we'll take care of this." Without a second thought, Henry reached into his own pocket and pulled out enough money to cover the cost of the fuel. With a calm and deliberate motion, he handed the money to the old man. "No need to worry about it," he said kindly. "You can pay me back later. I trust you." William's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. He stood there, relieved but still slightly embarrassed by the unexpected act of kindness. "Thank you, young man," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I promise I'll return every penny." Henry nodded, still smiling. "That's not important right now. What matters is that you're all right." For a brief moment, the old man gripped Henry's hand, expressing his gratitude without words. His eyes, filled with tears, reflected the deep sense of relief and thankfulness he couldn't quite articulate. "You have no idea how much this means to me," William said, his voice shaking with emotion. He reached into his old bag once again and this time pulled out a piece of paper. With shaky hands, he wrote down his name and address. Carefully folding the paper, he handed it to Henry. "So you'll know where to find me," William said, offering for Henry to come by and collect the money later. "I'm an honest man, you can trust me." Henry accepted the paper with a smile and carefully tucked it into the pocket of his uniform. "I believe you, William. Don't worry," Henry reassured him. Meanwhile, other employees at the gas station had been watching the interaction from a distance, exchanging glances filled with disbelief. They were accustomed to dealing with tough situations and difficult customers, so the idea of helping someone out of sheer kindness seemed strange and unnecessary to them. "Henry, you're too kind," one of his colleagues, Paul, said while shaking his head. "You'd better be careful. Not everyone's as honest as they seem." Henry simply shrugged, not losing his smile. "I choose to believe in people until they prove me wrong," he responded calmly. "I think everyone deserves a chance." Another coworker, Tom, couldn't resist adding a sarcastic comment. "That old guy's probably a scammer," Tom said with a smirk. "There's always someone trying to pull a fast one. Old folks know how to play the sympathy card." Henry heard these hurtful comments and felt a tightness in his chest. He knew that distrust and cynicism were common in their line of work, but he couldn't accept that they would treat an elderly man with such disdain. Instead of joining in their criticism, he walked over to William, who was preparing to leave, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. William looked up at him, his eyes still filled with gratitude and a hint of sadness from overhearing the harsh words. "Don't worry about what they're saying," Henry said loud enough for his colleagues to hear. "I trust you. Their words don't mean anything." The workers who had made the rude remarks fell silent, their faces showing a mixture of surprise and mild embarrassment. Henry's quiet confidence and kindness made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate such disrespect. Still teary-eyed, William gripped Henry's hand once more in a silent gesture of thanks. "Thank you again, son," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Your kindness means the world to me. Henry smiled, feeling a warmth inside him that was stronger than the heat of the day. It's nothing, William. Helping people is what we should do. Kindness comes back twice as strong, he replied. William nodded, gave Henry's hand a final squeeze, and then got into his car. He thanked Henry one last time, wiping tears from his face as he sat behind the wheel of his old vehicle. With a grateful wave, he drove off, and Henry waved back, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction for doing what was right. As the engine hummed and the car slowly pulled away, Henry stood there, watching until it disappeared from sight. Henry had always stood out among his coworkers for his kindness and willingness to help others. However, this open-heartedness wasn't always well received by those around him. Some of his colleagues, particularly Paul and Tom, often looked at Henry with a mix of envy and confusion. It irritated them that Henry wasn't like them, cynical, looking out for himself, and always trying to get ahead at the expense of others. His kindness seemed to bother them, as though it reminded them of something they were missing in themselves. They would often tease him, calling him too nice or even naive. "You're too nice for this world, Henry," Paul would often say with a smirk. "People are just going to use you, and you won't even see it coming?" "Yeah," Tom would chime in sarcastically. "You trust people way too much. Life's going to teach you that you can't be that gullible." Those comments often left Henry silent, but he never wavered in his belief. He continued to trust in people, hoping that one day his colleagues would understand that kindness wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. But with every passing day, his confidence in this philosophy seemed to irritate them more. When the situation with William unfolded and Henry helped the elderly man, his coworkers couldn't keep quiet. Paul and Tom stood by, watching as Henry gave his own money to pay for William's fuel, exchanging glances filled with disapproval. "See that? Once again, our soft-hearted Henry is at it," Tom muttered, shaking his head. "He thinks he's saving the world, but all he's doing is making himself broke. It's going to bite him," Paul added with a sneer. "Just wait and see. He needs to learn a lesson." And so, they came up with a plan. After William had driven off and Henry returned to his duties, Paul and Tom went to see the station manager, Kevin. They told him they had seen Henry taking money from the cash register to pay for a customer's fuel. They knew it wasn't true, but their jealousy and resentment toward Henry's kindness pushed them to act. This was their chance to get rid of the one who stood out from the rest, the one who made them feel guilty without even trying. Later that afternoon, as the flow of customers finally began to slow down, Henry thought he could take a brief moment to relax. But his thoughts were interrupted when Kevin, the station manager, called him into his office. Kevin looked unusually serious, with a concerned expression that Henry hadn't often seen on his face. "Henry, I need to talk to you," Kevin said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. Henry sat down, sensing that this was going to be a difficult conversation. He had no idea what was coming, but the tension in the room was palpable. "I've heard some things about what happened today," Kevin began, choosing his words carefully. "One of the employees told me they saw you take money from the cash register to pay for a customer's gas." Henry was stunned. A mix of shock, anger, and sadness hit him all at once. He immediately shook his head, denying the accusation. "No, Kevin, that's not true," Henry replied firmly. "I used my own money to help an elderly man who was in a tough spot. He seemed genuinely worried, and I couldn't just leave him stranded. I didn't take a penny from the register." Kevin observed Henry carefully, assessing his sincerity. "So you're saying you used your personal money to pay for his fuel?" Kevin asked. "Yes," Henry confirmed, his eyes reflecting the seriousness of his words. "I believed in what he said and was willing to risk my own money to help. It felt like the right thing to do." Kevin remained silent for a few seconds, thoughtfully staring at Henry. He had known Henry for some time and recognized him as an honest and dedicated employee. But Kevin also had to consider all the information he had received before making any decisions. "What you did was very noble," Kevin finally said, his expression softening slightly. "But you must understand that any movement of money, whether it's from the cash register or personal funds, can easily be misinterpreted." Henry nodded, understanding the concern. "I get that, Kevin," he responded. "It was an impulse to help someone in need. I didn't think about the possible consequences." Kevin listened intently, picking up on the honesty in Henry's voice. However, Kevin's expression remained serious and firm. He sighed deeply before speaking again. "I'm sorry, Henry, but if we make an exception here, others might think it's acceptable to do the same, and it could lead to bigger issues. I understand your good intentions, but we have to follow the rules." Kevin's words hit Henry like a bolt from the blue. He knew he had acted out of the kindness of his heart, but he hadn't anticipated that his good deed would lead to such harsh consequences. There was a clear lack of sympathy or understanding in Kevin's tone, despite Henry's loyalty to his job and his willingness to help others. Kevin, please, you have to understand, Henry tried to explain, but Kevin raised his hand, signaling him to stop. I understand, Henry, but I can't let this go unaddressed, Kevin continued. The decision has already been made. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask for your badge and keys. Henry's heart sank. He knew that his actions had been misinterpreted, but he couldn't believe that they were leading to his dismissal. With a heavy sigh, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his badge and keys, and placed them on Kevin's desk. I hope you find a place where your good intentions are recognized for what they are, Kevin added, softening slightly. But here, we have to be strict about the rules. Henry stood up, feeling a weight on his soul. He nodded in gratitude and left the office, still in disbelief over what had just happened. The gas station, where he had worked so long and tried to make a difference, now felt cold and lifeless. His colleagues had betrayed him, twisting the truth to get him fired. Henry slowly walked over to his locker, gathered his few belongings, and headed toward the exit. Despite losing his job, he didn't regret his decision to help the old man. He knew in his heart that he had done the right thing. As Henry reached the door, Paul, one of the colleagues who had sold him out, approached him with a smug grin on his face. See what happens when you're too nice? Paul began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You always say kindness comes back to you, right? So what did you get for your kindness? You got fired. Your kindness, Henry, is what destroyed you. Henry stopped in his tracks and looked at Paul. His heart pounded with frustration, but he kept his composure. These words should have angered him, should have made him feel defeated. But instead, all he felt was sadness. Sadness that his colleagues didn't see the true value of kindness, that they didn't understand how his actions defined him, not as a victim but as someone with strength of character. You don't get it, Paul, Henry said calmly, despite the pain he felt inside. Kindness isn't measured by what you get in return. It's not about rewards or recognition. It's about who you are inside. Even if I've lost my job, I still believe I did the right thing. And your words? They mean nothing to me. Paul was taken aback, clearly not expecting such a composed response. His smug grin faltered, and though he tried to maintain his cynical demeanor, the confidence in Henry's words left him momentarily speechless. Let's see where your kindness takes you, Paul muttered before turning and walking away. Henry watched him leave, then exhaled deeply, gathering his thoughts. He left the station, feeling the weight of the day's events pressing down on him, but he wasn't broken. He knew that, despite everything, he would continue to follow his path, holding true to his principles. And even if his kindness had seemed unappreciated at that moment, he knew within that it was the only right choice. When Henry finally returned home, his mother, Sarah, was in the living room, engrossed in her daily routine. Her presence had always been a source of comfort and love for Henry. In this difficult moment, her calmness and support seemed like a lifeline. Sarah noticed the somber expression on Henry's face and immediately sensed that something was wrong. She tried to gauge the situation gently. How was your day, son? Henry hesitated for a moment, struggling to find the right words. The weight of his emotions and the sense of failure still hung heavily on him. He knew he needed to tell her the truth, but the thought of revealing that he had lost his job made him feel even more vulnerable. Finally, he gathered his courage and looked at his mother with sadness in his eyes. Mom, I need to tell you something. I lost my job today. Sarah's face immediately showed concern, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of the situation. She stood up slowly from the couch, her body weighed down not only by age but by the emotional toll of seeing her son in distress. Lost your job? What happened, Henry? She asked, her voice filled with worry. Henry swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. It wasn't just about losing the job, it was about the principle behind it. He wanted to explain everything, but the thought of burdening his mother with more worries made it difficult to speak. Finally, with a deep breath, he began recounting the events of the day, his encounter with the elderly man, the moment he decided to help, and the cruel betrayal by his coworkers that led to his dismissal. As he spoke, his voice trembled, especially when he reached the part where Kevin had told him he was being let go. Sarah listened intently, her eyes never leaving her son's face. She could see the pain behind every word and felt her heart ache for him. When Henry finished, there were tears in her eyes, not just from the injustice of it all but from the pride she felt for the man he had become. Henry, she began softly, her voice filled with both sadness and admiration, what you did was right. I know it feels unfair right now, and I know you're hurting, but you helped someone in need, and that's something to be proud of. Henry, still feeling the weight of everything, nodded, though his mind was clouded with doubt. His mother's words were comforting, but the reality of losing his job and how they would manage without his income gnawed at him. But Mom, Henry said, his voice breaking slightly, how are we going to make it without my job? I wanted to help, but now I feel like I've put us in a worse situation. Sarah moved closer to him, placing her hands gently on his shoulders, her eyes filled with the warmth of a mother's love. "We'll manage," she said with conviction. "We always have. Your father and I raised you to do the right thing, and you've done that. Money comes and goes, but your integrity, your kindness, that's what truly matters. We'll get through this, I promise." Henry felt a small wave of relief wash over him. His mother's strength and belief in him had always been a source of comfort, and even now, when everything seemed to be falling apart, she remained steadfast. Before Henry could respond, the phone on the small table by the window rang. Both of them turned their heads in its direction, the unexpected interruption momentarily breaking the tension in the room. With a sigh, Henry stood up and walked over to the phone, picking up the receiver. "Hello," he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. A calm and friendly voice greeted him on the other end. "Hello, is this Henry?" the voice asked. "Yes, this is Henry. Who's calling?" "My name is Eric," the voice replied. "I'm William's grandson, the gentleman you helped at the gas station earlier today." Henry's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to hear from the old man's family. For a moment, he was unsure of how to respond. "Oh, yes, I remember," Henry replied, his curiosity piqued. "How can I help you?" Eric's voice was warm and filled with gratitude. "I just wanted to thank you for what you did for my grandfather. He told me everything when he got home, and I was really touched by your kindness. I wanted to make sure you knew how much we appreciate it." Henry felt a surge of emotion. In the midst of all the chaos and frustration of the day, it was comforting to know that his actions hadn't gone unnoticed. "It was my pleasure to help him," Henry said sincerely. "He seemed like he really needed it, and I'm just glad I could do something." There was a brief pause on the other end before Eric continued. "My grandfather also mentioned that you were let go from your job because of what happened. Is that true?" Eric asked, his voice tinged with concern. Henry hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal, but eventually, he decided to be honest. "Yeah, unfortunately, it is," Henry admitted, feeling the sting of the words. "I used my own money to help him, but my coworkers twisted the story and told my boss that I took it from the cash register. So, I was let go." Eric's tone shifted, now filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "That's unbelievable," Eric said, clearly upset. "It's wrong on so many levels, and I can't imagine how frustrating that must be for you." Henry remained silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "Listen," Eric continued, "my family and I would like to do more than just thank you. My grandfather feels terrible that helping him caused you to lose your job, and we want to make it right. Can we meet tomorrow to talk? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Henry, still processing everything, glanced over at his mother, who was watching him closely, waiting for some sign of what was happening. "Of course," Henry finally said, though he wasn't sure what to expect. "I'd be happy to meet. What time works for you?" "How about late morning?" Eric suggested. "We can meet at the cafe near the gas station. I'll be there around 11. "That sounds good," Henry agreed. "Great, I'll see you tomorrow," Eric said before hanging up. Henry slowly put the phone back on the hook, turning to face his mother. Her eyes were filled with hope, eager to hear what had just transpired. "That was William's grandson," Henry said, his voice still filled with surprise. "He wants to meet tomorrow. Apparently, they want to do something to make things right." Sarah's eyes brightened at the news, and she smiled softly. "See, Henry," she said with pride. "Kindness always finds its way back." Henry nodded, feeling a spark of hope ignite in his heart. The next morning, Henry made his way to the cafe where he was supposed to meet Eric. The cool breeze of the early day helped clear his mind as he walked, still thinking about what the meeting might bring. He arrived a few minutes early and took a seat at one of the outdoor tables, ordering a coffee while he waited. It wasn't long before Eric arrived, a tall, friendly-looking man in his mid-30s with a warm smile. He greeted Henry with a firm handshake. "Henry, it's great to finally meet you," Eric said, sitting down across from him. "I've been looking forward to this." "Likewise," Henry replied, though his curiosity about the purpose of the meeting still lingered. Eric wasted no time getting to the point. "First, I want to thank you again for helping my grandfather," Eric said. "It meant a lot to him, and to us as a family. What you did was rare, and we wanted to make sure that you know how much we appreciate it." Henry smiled humbly, nodding as he listened. "But there's more," Eric continued. "My family owns a chain of gas stations in the area, including the one where you were working. When I heard that you were let go because of your good deed, I was furious. We don't want to lose someone like you over something like this." Henry's eyes widened as he realized what Eric was leading up to. "So, we'd like to offer you a job," Eric said with a smile. "A management position at one of our stations, if you're interested. We think someone with your character and integrity is exactly what we need." Henry was stunned. He had come to the meeting expecting little more than a simple gesture of gratitude, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. Are you serious? Henry asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Absolutely, Eric replied confidently. We need more people like you, people who genuinely care about others and who do the right thing, even when it's not easy. And from what I've heard, you're exactly that kind of person. Henry sat in silence for a moment, letting the offer sink in. It was an opportunity he hadn't expected, and the idea of taking on a managerial role felt both exciting and daunting. I don't know what to say, Henry finally spoke, his voice still laced with surprise. This is incredible. I'm honored. Eric grinned. No need to decide right now. Think it over, but we'd love to have you on board. Henry smiled, feeling a sense of hope and purpose returning. This was more than just a job offer, it was validation that doing the right thing, even when it came at a personal cost, was always worth it. After a long conversation filled with plans and possibilities, Henry left the cafe, his mind buzzing with the prospect of a fresh start. As he walked home, he couldn't help but think about his mother's words, kindness always finds its way back. As Henry walked back home, the weight of the previous day's events seemed to lift with each step. The breeze felt cooler, the sunlight brighter, and the world around him seemed to pulse with renewed energy. The offer Eric had presented to him wasn't just a job, it was a new beginning, a validation that his principles and beliefs weren't in vain. When he arrived at the small house he shared with his mother and sister, Sarah was waiting for him by the door. Her anxious expression softened when she saw the smile on Henry's face. How did it go? She asked, her voice filled with anticipation. Henry couldn't help but let out a small laugh, his joy bubbling over as he told his mother and sister everything that had happened during the meeting with Eric. From the gratitude of William's family to the unexpected job offer, Henry recounted every detail, watching as their faces lit up with disbelief and happiness. Can you believe it? Henry said, shaking his head as if he still couldn't quite process it himself. They want me to manage one of their stations. It's an incredible opportunity, Mom. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of pride and relief. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Henry, hugging him tightly. I told you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I told you that your kindness would come back to you. I am so proud of you, Henry. Henry hugged her back, feeling the warmth of his mother's love wash over him. It was a moment of pure gratitude, for his family, for the chance to start anew, and for the unexpected twists that life sometimes offered. Later that evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, the atmosphere was light and hopeful. The worries that had clouded the house the day before were now replaced with laughter and optimism. Do you think you'll take the job? His sister, Lily, asked as she passed him a bowl of mashed potatoes. Henry nodded, his mind clearer now. I think so. It's a great opportunity, and after everything that's happened, it feels like the right next step. Lily smiled. You deserve it, Henry. And I bet you'll be the best manager they've ever had. The evening passed quickly, and as the family settled down for the night, Henry lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about everything that had happened, how just one small act of kindness had set off a chain of events that he never could have predicted. Life, he realized, had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. The next morning, Henry called Eric to accept the job offer. They made arrangements for Henry to visit the station later in the week to begin his training. Eric was thrilled to have him on board, and the excitement in his voice made Henry feel even more certain about his decision. By the end of the week, Henry found himself standing in front of a different gas station, not the one where everything had fallen apart, but a new location that felt like a fresh start. The familiar sounds of cars pulling in and out of the station filled the air, and as Henry took a deep breath, he felt a sense of calm. Eric met him at the entrance, greeting him with the same friendly smile he had worn during their first meeting. Ready to get started? Eric asked. Absolutely, Henry replied, feeling a surge of determination. The next few days were a whirlwind of training, meetings with the staff, and getting accustomed to his new role. Henry quickly found that he enjoyed the responsibilities of managing the station. He liked working with people, ensuring that the customers were happy, and, most of all, he valued the opportunity to lead with the same kindness and integrity that had guided him through life. As the weeks went by, Henry settled into his new position. He developed a rapport with the team and quickly earned their respect. The station thrived under his leadership, and customers frequently commented on the positive atmosphere he had cultivated. One day, as Henry was wrapping up his shift, a familiar car pulled into the station. It was William, the elderly man whom Henry had helped that fateful day. He stepped out of the car slowly, but with a smile that showed he was happy to see Henry. Henry! William called out, walking over to him. It's good to see you, my boy. I've heard so much about how well you're doing. Henry grinned, shaking William's hand warmly. It's all thanks to you, William. If it weren't for that day at the station, I wouldn't be here. William chuckled, shaking his head. Nonsense. You're here because of who you are, because of your heart, your kindness. I'm just glad I got to be a part of your story." They stood there for a moment, talking like old friends, the warmth of their connection undeniable. As William prepared to leave, he turned back to Henry one last time, his voice soft but full of meaning. "Never forget, Henry," William said. "Kindness always finds its way back." Henry nodded, the truth of those words resonating deeply within him. He watched as William drove away, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment that went beyond the job or the responsibilities he had taken on. In the end, Henry realized that his journey hadn't just been about finding a new job or proving himself to others. It had been about staying true to who he was, even when the world seemed unfair. It was about believing in the power of kindness, no matter the cost. And as he looked around at the life he had built, Henry knew, without a doubt, that kindness had indeed come full circle. Thank you for listening to the story to the end. Write your thoughts about it in the comments. Subscribe to the channel Tell Me and share this video with your friends and loved ones. This motivates us to continue working on new stories every day. Do not miss the next amazing story that is about to appear on your screen. We are very grateful to you for being with us. In the description under this video you can open the catalog of all the stories. See you there.